You know, it's often said that China's president and secretary general of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, is the world's most powerful man. But given how much time we spend analyzing and thinking about China, we still understand preciously little about the worldview of Xi and his inner circle. What exactly is Xi Jinping Thought, which has been promoted in schools, universities, and the public sphere in China? And how does it influence China's view on the world? Here today to help me answer these questions is Professor Steve Tsang. I'm thrilled that he is joining us today. He is the director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Professor Tsang is also an emeritus fellow of St. Anthony's College at Oxford and an associate fellow at Chatham House. He's a widely published author on China's politics, history, and foreign affairs, among many, many other topics. And of course, his current research project is on the political thought of Xi Jinping. Professor Tsang, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Nico. Great pleasure. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. We'll divide today's conversation into three parts. First, we will discuss the core tenets of Xi Jinping Thought. Then we will evaluate how Xi Jinping Thought influences China's global strategy. And last, we will discuss a few concrete examples of how this may or may not play out in the future. To jump right in, Professor Tsang, we've been obviously hearing a lot about Xi Jinping Thought, over the last months and years. It's something that has taken on a certain amount of prominence, at least in Chinese domestic life. But I found myself wondering, as I was reading up on Xi Jinping Thought, that I wasn't quite sure of what it was, how we would define it. Is Xi Jinping Thought best thought of as a political philosophy? Is it a state ideology? Is it basically just a collection of things that Xi Jinping has said at some point? What's the best way for us to conceptualize Xi Jinping Thought?
Well, Xi Jinping Thought was introduced to the world at the 19th Party Congress by Xi Jinping and the Communist Party in 2017. What I think it is meant to do is to eventually completely replace communism and become China's ideology. At the moment, I would call it perhaps a kind of a proto-ideology. It's nearly there, but not quite completely there. And Xi Jinping Thought is not just the ideas and thinkings of Xi Jinping himself. Unlike Mao Zedong thought, when Mao Zedong proclaimed it and pushed it to the Communist Party, he had been leader of China for quite a while and had a long period of time to develop his concepts. Xi Jinping hasn't really quite done that. He's not the kind of thinker that Mao Zedong was, but he has a very strong team of supporters led by Huang Guning in the Politburo Standing Committee, who would essentially guess what Xi Jinping really wants and draft all the major statements that Xi Jinping had to make. So even though a lot of the words were drafted by others, they were adopted and approved of for issue in his name. So they do effectively amount to what Xi Jinping want China and the rest of the world to think of as his ideology for the country.
Now, I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into, what Xi Jinping Thought actually says, sort of the beliefs and ideas that it promotes. Given that Xi Jinping Thought has also, as I mentioned at the beginning, been promoted, towards the Chinese public in schools and universities, I wanted to start by asking you, do you have a good sense of what the average Chinese person knows about Xi Jinping Thought? So if we were to make a survey, and perhaps somebody has even done that, in, let's say a larger Chinese city, asking people what they think Xi Jinping Thought is, what kind of answers would we presumably get?
Well, we don't know. I am not aware of any independent survey on what people in China think of Xi Jinping Thought and how much they know about what Xi Jinping Thought really is. There is an app in China that previously Communist Party members were required to download onto their mobiles and practice and therefore learn about Xi Jinping Thought practically on a daily basis. Now, others are being encouraged to do the same. A lot of people don't take it very seriously. I think we have to take it very seriously. Xi Jinping meant what he says. But we are also in a situation where we have in Xi Jinping a leader of a very, very powerful authoritarian state who is very thin-skinned. He doesn't like anybody saying anything about Xi Jinping thought that is potentially embarrassing. Xi Jinping is on a pedestal and he must be respected and admired as far as Xi Jinping and his close colleagues are concerned.
Now, if you had to briefly summarize the contents of Xi Jinping thought, and I understand from what you said before, it's in a way also something that's still developing, so we may not know exactly of what Xi Jinping thought comprises, but still, there's certain things we can start to tease out. So what are the main pillars, if you want, of Xi Jinping thought, and how are they maybe different from from what sort of the prevailing thinking in China before that? So what are the new concepts that Xi Jinping thought is introducing?
Well, the first thing to acknowledge about Xi Jinping thought is that from around 1989 onward, old-fashioned communism effectively had collapsed as an ideology in China. And even though leaders like Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao continued to refer to the party's commitments to communism or Chinese socialism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, very few people in China took that seriously. Xi Jinping changed that. And a very important part of Xi Jinping thought is that this is now the new ultimate synthesized version of Marxism, which combined both what Xi Jinping understood to be Marxism together with what Xi Jinping understood to be China's traditions and history, and merged together into one. So unlike your orthodox or older-fashioned Marxism, which is meant to be universal, this Chinese socialism of Xi Jinping is meant for China. It's not for export. It's a very synthesized, to put it politely, or not so politely, it's a Sino-centric version of some form of socialism. It's something which Karl Marx would not have recognized. It's something that Confucius would not recognize. It would not be recognized by Confucius as Chinese. It would not be recognized by Karl Marx as Marxist. But it is the Chinese socialism that China will have to embrace. Everybody in China are required to do that. The second important part about this Chinese socialism is the centrality of the Communist Party and its top leader. Xi Jinping made it very clear. In China, doesn't matter whether it is north, south, east, west, or in the middle. It doesn't matter in what walk of life one is talking about. The party leads everything. No if, no but, no exceptions. The leadership of the party is absolutely at the center of it, that it is only with the Communist Party. And this is where that Chinese socialism incorporates a party-centric nationalism into the whole thing. That everybody in China gets to where it is because how the Communist Party has made China great again. And through Xi Jinping thought, it will guide China to reach the promised land when China will be truly great again, when China will restore its rightful place in the world, when the China dream of national rejuvenation will have been achieved, when China would be in the center of the universe, admired by all. But there is that socialist streak, however imperfect, which is genuinely there, which guides the direction of travel for China moving forward. There's also the incorporation of the innovative technical science of it that China will want to be focusing on.
You've already talked a little bit about sort of the international global dimension of Xi Jinping thought. Before we get there, I do want to briefly, given the fact that it's, as you said, very sort of focused on China itself, I do want to briefly talk about recent domestic developments and how they are connected to Xi Jinping thought. So a lot of things have happened in China over recent months. And I think maybe the one thing that we could pick out from that is the introduction of the concept of common prosperity, which has been floating around for a while, but I think has now really taken center stage, in which, depending on how it's interpreted, kind of advocates at the very least a distribution of wealth that is less unequal than the one we have today. I think the interpretations I've read sort of stop short of calling this communist. It's still very much sort of rooted in the kind of market-oriented thinking that has dominated China recently. How, if at all, is common prosperity linked to Xi Jinping thought? Is it an outflow of Xi Jinping thought? Is it a part of it? Is it sort of a parallel concept? How should we connect these two?
Well, it is part of your Xi Jinping thought now. And the common prosperity is really actually a very interesting concept. Because if we are talking about a true socialist, then a basic expectation is that the core socialist concept of from each according to one's ability and to each according to one's need will have to be there. It will have to be the starting point of it. And given that China is a Leninist political system, where, as Xi Jinping would put it, everything is under the leadership of the party, how could you have allowed such great disparity of wealth and incomes to come into existence to begin with? Okay, Xi Jinping inherited that, but why can he not simply use taxation and administrative means for the redistribution of wealth and income, and therefore achieve some element of that socialist ideal, to which, in the context of the 21st century, the most basic would be some form of a welfare state. Now, Xi Jinping does not accept a welfare state as something which China under the Communist Party should aim to achieve in the foreseeable future. I don't think he has completely ruled out totally forever, but it is simply not on the political agenda at the moment. That redistribution is more for reducing the gap of the disparity and making the party look good. Because after all, requiring the really super rich to give to charity, but not specifically requiring which charity and how much, is a very inefficient way to redistribute unequal wealth and income. The party has the means to do that much more effectively, has chosen not to, because ultimately the priority for all that is being said about Xi Jinping thought being the new ideology is not the ideological commitment to socialism, but the commitment to keep the Communist Party in power and able to command the support of people in China, and common prosperity delivers that, at least in their conception, because it makes the party look good. It comes across as a kind of the 21st century populism, which Xi Jinping actually rather likes.
Let's move on now and talk about what Xi Jinping thought can tell us about how China's global strategy will look like. Maybe first, you've talked about sort of the ultimate goal of Xi Jinping thought and China's current leadership, sort of achieving rejuvenation, and you sort of interpreted that as sort of China being at the center of the world and well liked around. Can we dive a little bit deeper into this, and can you maybe tell us, in your view, what does Xi Jinping thought tell us about how the Chinese leadership, obviously including Xi Jinping, sees the world? What kind of worldview is embedded in Xi Jinping thought?
Okay. Xi Jinping thought aims to achieve the national rejuvenation of China, encapsulated in that idea of the China dream. The ways to achieve it is to secure the uninterrupted rise of China, in contrast to under Hu Jintao, the peaceful rise of China. Now under Xi Jinping, it is the uninterrupted rise. Instead of China requesting and requiring the rest of the world to pay it due respect, Xi Jinping now simply come out and demands the rest of the world pay it due respect. What kind of a world does Xi Jinping want? Now, Xi Jinping does not want China to replace the United States as the sole superpower in the world with all the baggages that it also implies. Because the US position, much whether you like it or not, whether you find it positive or negative, carries a lot of baggages, including a lot of international obligations, which this sole superpower has to shoulder. Xi Jinping has no intention to see China being put in that position. Xi Jinping's concept is a kind of a return to that mythical, traditional Chinese concept of a 10 Shah, all under heaven, when China was that mythical celestial empire, that China, by its superiority, both of its political systems and its culture and civilizations, became practically the center of the universe to which every other country would look up to, respect, and admire. Because when he talked about the points of reference for China's greatness, we are looking at the high chain, the height of the empire of the last imperial dynasty in China, empire of the Manchus, the Qing dynasty. Or going back a bit, then you have your Tang, or you have your Han, or your, indeed, the very first Chinese emperor, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi. I mean, those were the kinds of models that Xi Jinping would look up to. It's a bad interpretation of history. History was a bit rather more complicated than that, and that all under heaven concept with the rest of the world all looking up to and admiring the emperor of China simply was more of a mythical construction than historical reality. But Xi Jinping has had monopoly of the truth and history. His version of history is now that is being taught in China.
What I find very interesting and wanted to pause on for a minute is that what you're saying is that if we look, if we were to try to place China's ambition on a spectrum, you know, where on the one end you have, you know, like wanting to rule the world, becoming a US-style hegemon, and then on the other side of the spectrum we'd have, you know, just being content with having domestic stability but not wanting to exercise any influence internationally at all. What you're saying is that China not so much is seeking to place itself somewhere in between those two poles, but it's actually seeking to go like almost on a different dimension of what you described, kind of as this mythical place where it's, you know, where we have a situation of Tianxia, where China kind of like rules, but not by sort of by exercising direct power, but just by sort of being the focal point of the world. Is that sort of, would that be an accurate summary of what Xi Jinping thought encompasses?
Pretty much. I think what we have to bear in mind is that often we look at China using Western intellectual methodologies and Western concepts and Western experience as benchmarks. China under Xi Jinping doesn't do that. China engages the rest of the world on China's terms, doesn't want to engage with the rest of the world on Western or other people's terms. So you have this concept of China actually playing a sort of two-level games. On the one level, it does engage with the liberal international order that we have since the end of the Second World War, make the most of it, and use it to the advantage of China, which China has done spectacularly successfully in the last 20 years or so, and it will continue to do so. But at the same time, it also wants to make sure that it does not get into, in quotation marks, the trap of simply having to follow that. Mm. So it wants a different way eventually to engage with it on the basis of the existing order, modifying it rather than completely changing it. But if it modifies sufficiently, then you get into a situation where China can be the top dog in the world without having to carry all the baggages of the previous top dog or the existing top dog, which happens to be the United States of America. And that's why I think that's sometimes US-centric colleagues looking at it as China just trying to squeeze America out, replacing America, or your Thucydides trap concept gives a slightly distorted impression of what the Chinese government wants to do, which also provides a basis for the Chinese government to say that, no, this is not what we are trying to do, which in a sense, they are right. That's not what they're trying to do. They're trying to do something else. Where you have pretty much this similar result would be that it means ultimately that China expects and wants to be the top dog. Now, whether it will ever get there is a different story. I'm simply saying that that would be something that Xi Jinping would be rather comfortable with.
Professor Tsang, one thing that I wanted to ask you about is there's often this conversation about China being a reformist or a revisionist power, and you've also written about that, and I think it sort of fits neatly into this conversation we're just having now, because these terms are sort of being used a lot. I think it would be helpful also for people to get a quick definition. So what do we mean when we describe China as either reformist or revisionist? What's the difference between these two states?
I think when we talk about whether China is a revisionist power, we, on the one hand, is contrasting it against whether that is a status quo power. China is not a status quo power, but a revisionist power would be expected to go and change the rules. A reformist power does not necessarily want to completely change the rule. It wants to adjust the rules, modify it to make it work to its own advantage or in a different kind of way, which we have seen the Chinese government doing, as I say, quite effectively particularly in the last decade, but I would say a bit over the last decade. It goes beyond Xi Jinping. In fact, it really is closer to more like 20 years.
Before we then turn to audience questions, I do want to, we sort of talked about this sort of in a way, sort of on a theoretical level of sort of looking at what Xi Jinping thought sort of says in theory. Let's apply this now maybe to a few examples, and let's try to play through or think through what an application of Xi Jinping thought, the way you have laid it out, would really mean. And I think the one thing that we certainly talk about, which, because it's on a lot of people's mind, of course, is the case of Taiwan. Now, one could say, you use this term of uninterrupted rise, that given that, there's maybe under this logic a heightened risk, if you want, of a military conflict involving Taiwan, because leadership of the Chinese mainland would not sort of want its rise to be interrupted by not being able to reabsorb Taiwan. On the other hand, you also laid out, that it's not necessarily for China about exerting direct force and sort of, acting as a hegemonial power. So in the case of Taiwan, how should we think about that? What is the sort of, what is the logic on Taiwan as it's being dictated by Xi Jinping thought? It doesn't mean that that's necessarily what's going to happen, but sort of if we take the ideology seriously, what should we expect to happen?
Very worried. I think we really need to be very, very concerned about Taiwan. With the articulation of the China dream of national rejuvenation and the underlying of the description of Taiwan as the sacred territory of China, how can Xi Jinping claim that he has delivered the China dream without securing in his terms the return of this sacred territory of Taiwan. Now, there are a huge amount of contradictions inherent in what is being said and with history, because believe it or not, one of the earliest and most vocal advocates of the independence of Taiwan was the Communist Party of China itself, and it did so all the way through from the 1920s into the 1940s, and even at the Sixth Party Congress held in Moscow in 1928, it even issued a clear document saying that the Communist Party of China, in line with the Third Communist International, the Kuomintern, fully support the independence of Taiwan and its people struggle for independence. So there's nothing to stop Xi Jinping going back on that historical position of the Communist Party, but it's not going to happen because of that particular presentation of Taiwan, and also because of the geostrategic importance of Taiwan to China today, and the change to the political system, to how the political system operates in China in the last 5 years. For about 20 years, after the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and then the Soviet Union, which happened in 1989 to 1991, the Communist Party of China had managed to avoid making one major policy mistake that could potentially destabilize the system. So it was an enormous achievement. And they achieved that by having a collective leadership and steadily increasing the scope of internal policy debates. All those changed at the 19th Party Congress of 2017, when Xi Jinping effectively put a close to collective leadership and internal policy debates. Now, the Politburo Standing Committee, the Politburo and the Central Committee are all echo chambers. Who amongst the military and other political leadership in China would dare to contradict Xi Jinping and challenge him over Taiwan? So there's nothing now to stop Xi Jinping going for Taiwan. So that is something which is going to be very risky. And if that should happen, it means pitting China and the US on opposite sides of a military confrontation. It means completely disrupting the global supply chain. China and Taiwan, both independently and collectively, are the two most important parts in the global supply chain. So even if the rest of the world are not involved, a military confrontation between China and the United States over Taiwan is going to cause economic upheaval globally. So this is something that we have to make sure that we can effectively deter Xi Jinping from trying to do so. If not, then we will be looking at a crisis, the like of which we have not seen since the end of the Second World War.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn to some audience questions. And again, to the audience, please keep those questions coming. We'll make sure that we can answer as many of them as possible over the next 15, 20 minutes or so. Let me start by one asking about what Xi Jinping thought means for the Chinese tech sector. And the way the question is phrased here is that obviously the tech sector has been under pressure. References here, Jack Ma being of Alibaba being effectively silenced, but also mentions that sort of the, let's say, stronger global adversity that we often see vis-a-vis China is a little bit of a problem for a Chinese tech sector that still, sees vast potential in expanding globally and globalizing its products and standards. So how should we think about the trade-off between these two things of sort of a state ideology that tries to be more assertive, that sort of tries to focus everything towards China, but also its economic need in the tech sector, but maybe also elsewhere, of not just continuing to engage with the world economically, but trying to sort of export to a certain extent own products and services? Do these two things eventually end up in conflict with each other?
Well, innovation and technological advancements are very important parts of what Xi Jinping wants to promote in China. And here he also wants to make sure that the innovative and technological advancement capacity of China are not at the mercy of the West or other foreign countries. He wants China to be both independent and indeed a leader in both. Now, the difficulty here is that while that is very much a priority, a very, very top priority in Xi Jinping's China or under Xi Jinping thought is to maintain the Communist Party's leadership and control in China across the board. Nobody, no company, no sector is allowed to challenge that. So we had, in effect, a situation where the tech sector were being given a lot of scope. It was, if you like, the equivalent of the Wild West for a long time in China for development, and you had the emergence of giants like Alibaba and Tencent and Huawei and the rest of them. Now, among all those, Huawei was a model company for the Chinese government. It doesn't do anything the Chinese government disapprove of. Alibaba got into trouble when Jack Ma made that infamous speech in front of global luminaries in the financial sector, talking about the Chinese banking regulator, financial regulators having a pawn shop mentality. Nobody is allowed to embarrass the Communist Party or its top leader internationally like that. That's triggered a response from the leadership in China until Xi Jinping basically authorized that Jack Ma could be taken down a notch or two. Jack Ma was untouchable. But once that was being done, the whole regulatory regime in China started to do their job, because the Chinese regulators have been uncomfortable with the way how a lot of the tech companies, and particularly the fintech companies, have been operating in China. Because while they were innovative, they were also reckless. They were doing the sort of things that if they were happening in the UK or the US or Switzerland, our regulators would have problems with. Mm. So once that opening was allowed, we saw that regulations being pushed very much ahead, but yet at the same time, there are limits being put in there, and Xi Jinping is not allowing those companies to go bust. So he's trying to maintain a kind of balance of continue to support the tech sectors to be innovative and flourish, but within the limits of coming under the leadership of the party and not challenging that.
Let me maybe follow up here with another audience question that I think is a good add-on to this. The question asks about essentially acceptance of the Communist Party, and implicitly through that Xi Jinping thought within the Chinese middle class. So on one hand, we, as you very well described, we have this state ideology that sort of strongly emphasizes centralized leadership by the Communist Party, that centralizes that the party is sort of above everything. On the other hand, the last decades of economic growth have created a wealthy, affluent middle class, which may or may not, at a certain point, resent sort of that kind of all-consuming state rule. Is there any reason to believe that at some point, sort of this current ideology of Xi Jinping thought would be subjected to stronger criticism at home? It doesn't seem like it right now, but is that a possible future scenario?
Well, anything can happen in this world. I think with COVID-19, we have all learned the lessons to never say never. But having said that, I think the prospect of Xi Jinping thought, or Xi Jinping himself, coming under criticism in China in the foreseeable future, we're talking about 5-10 years kind of time frame, is almost inconceivable, unless we are seeing something very dramatic that happens in China, a kind of disaster scenario when the economy was in a nosedive and could not be stopped, that whatever the government says in terms of government statistics of how well China is doing, people simply cannot make ends meet and are hugely suffering, so much so that they don't care any longer about what the repressive machines of the party states can do to them. But unless we are looking at that kind of scenario, no. Xi Jinping is not to be touched. Xi Jinping is not to be criticized. If something goes wrong in China, it is because somebody lower down the food chain, some cadres were corrupt or some cadres were not responsible enough, who make some mistakes, which the top leadership under Xi Jinping would fix. Xi Jinping is demigod. In this conception, he cannot be wrong.
What, in your view, or is there anything within Xi Jinping thought that would tell us about the current leadership's view on other forms of political organization, such as like a liberal democracy? I understand that very likely that's not a main aspect of Xi Jinping thought, and certainly not something that they want to move towards. But is there anything within the ideology that can tell us why the Chinese leadership thinks that this would not be a good model for China, beyond the fact that it would impact the absolute rule of the party? Is there an effort, I guess is what I'm trying to ask, and what the question from the audience is there an effort made sort of ideologically to explain why that's not a good form of political organization for current day China?
Well, Xi Jinping or his advisors will simply say that seek truth from facts. Are you blind? Can you not see how superior the Chinese system under Xi Jinping is? Have you not noticed that Western capitalism under Western democracies took the world to the global financial crisis, for which it was China under the Communist Party that saved it? Have you not seen how your so-called leaders of Western democracies, the United States, behave under Donald Trump? And the Americans still don't know whether they are going to get Trump back or not. And have you not seen the mother of democracies, the United Kingdom, getting something like Boris? And what do we have in China? We have Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. When was the last time we made mistakes like Boris or Donald Trump and a whole lot of others? They genuinely believe that the Chinese system now is superior to Western democracies. They just need to educate the people in China to fully understand that and appreciate that, and they will be very proud of China under the Communist Party. I mean, this is an important part of Xi Jinping thought. And this is where this Chinese socialism depart from traditional socialism, which was fundamentally a universalist concept. The Communist Party of China under Xi Jinping does not seek to export Chinese socialism, because you have to have the Communist Party of China and the Chinese people to make it work. Others may not be able to. But then we can still be an inspiration for the others. We will share China's experience to form the Chinese solutions to problems in the world without exporting Chinese socialism as the Soviet Union used to do during the Cold War.
Now, you mentioned a few times as just now, sort of this, I think, very important distinction of this not being a thinking, a philosophy, an ideology that is designed for export, so to speak. It's very sort of, if you want, indigenous to China and it's supposed to be there. At the same time, as we've discussed, it does have certain ramifications for how China interacts with the world. And given this sort of idea of China being the center of everything under this ideology, what is the best strategy for other countries, other nations to interact with China, right? We're in an interconnected world. There are global problems that need to be addressed, and they can only be solved if China is a part of the solution. Of course, climate change is first among those, but pandemic response is probably going to be a close second. There are many others. So, assuming, sort of understanding Xi Jinping thought correctly, what would it tell us about what the best way is to productively collaborate with China in areas where productive collaboration is a necessity?
Well, I think there are two things here. One is that diplomacy is needed the most when we need to engage with people or countries that do not agree with us. Diplomacy is less in demand among friends, it's more in demand among non-friends. So the more that we see China as being competitive with us, the more we require diplomacy to engage with our eyes wide open, because they have the same approach. They are not naive, they are not stupid, they know what they want to do, and they now have built up a huge amount of capacity to support what they try to do. The second bit we need to bear in mind is that we are not in a new ideological confrontation with China as we were during the Cold War between the so-called capitalist world of democracies and the socialist world of communism under the Soviet leadership. That era is gone. We are not getting to return to that, but we are in a beauty contest. The beauty contest is between whether the democratic systems are, in the long term, better for people, or whether the kind of very efficient, autocratic, neo-totalitarian system that China has is more able to make things better for people. China is not exporting Chinese socialism, but Xi Jinping's foreign policy is to make the world safe for authoritarian states. A world that is safe for authoritarian states is a world less safe for democracies. And let's also be realistic that vast parts of the world are neither democratic in the way that Western Europe and North America are, nor are they very efficient autocratic system like what China is. Most of them are somewhere in between. Which size they see as better for them is something that they will make judgments on the basis of what they see. So if Western democracies continues to be in the kind of trouble with the producing irresponsible and very bad leadership like the Donald Trump administration or the Boris Johnson administration, we are not going to be able to compete successfully with China, and we would not be able to engage with China on terms that we would like to in order to resolve some of the shared global challenges and problems. We will only have that leadership role if we can persuade the rest of the world, and indeed China, that we are worth listening to. So we have to win that beauty contest. We have to put our own house in order. We also have to acknowledge that this very Sino-centric approach of Xi Jinping's to both domestic politics and foreign policy will fundamentally weaken China's efforts to build up its soft power. And we have to allow scope for that effect to play out. I mean, hypothetically, think about this. If China did not have a foreign ministry, no diplomat in the last 2 years, none. Nothing that Chinese diplomats have said in the last 2 years was said. Will China not today enjoy a higher international standing than it actually does today? the unleashing of wolf warrior diplomats has done far more to damage China's standings than anything any Western political leaders has managed to do in the last 2 years. We should learn that lesson too.
I think, let me just say before we move on, I think that's an excellent thought experiment. I had never thought about it this way, but I think that is actually a very good way to think about it. Also, as we sort of continue to observe China's diplomatic behavior. I wanted to put another audience question towards you. The question asks about the probability of China moving into the direction of what the questioner calls a 21st century, probably less disruptive version of the Cultural Revolution. Now, I'm not entirely sure how that would look like. So let me maybe broaden the question a bit to asking, what are the chances, what's the likelihood of Xi Jinping thought and the changes it brings with it of seriously and possibly adversely affecting everyday life of Chinese citizens? Because one could argue that so far Xi Jinping thought has had preciously little impact on the daily lives of people in China. Life is going on, the economy is still growing, so why should they care about Xi Jinping thought? Is there a chance that this will change at some point?
With due respect, I disagree with that. I think Xi Jinping thought or Xi Jinping rule, or the two together, are already changing how people live their life in China. The overall atmosphere in China is getting a lot more restrictive. The curriculums from kindergartens to universities are being changed. The way how the party operates is being changed. The scope for individual freedom has been changed. An entire breed of human rights lawyers that we saw in China in the 20 years before Xi Jinping have been practically wiped out. Dissent is gone. So people's lives are being changed. Businesses now realize that they have to be prepared that if and when the party state wants their particular business, they will need to know what to do. They will need to be, in quotation marks, patriotic and be willing and happy to hand over their business to the state. Now, all these are significant changes. But will Xi Jinping bring back a kind of a cultural revolution in the 21st century context? Now that, I would say no. This is where Xi Jinping really is very different from Mao Zedong. He's not attempting a Maoist restoration. Mao could be very undisciplined and willing to accept and embrace indeed chaos. And Mao did destroy the Communist Party in the Cultural Revolution because he basically threw a tantrum. Xi Jinping is a very highly disciplined, arguably perhaps the most disciplined Leninist in the Communist Party's history in China. The Leninist is about party and party discipline. The party is right at the core of everything Xi Jinping wants to do. He will not turn on the party and risk destruction of the party and therefore the instrument with which he needs to deliver his China dream. And the Cultural Revolution was a Maoist attempt to achieve Maoist vision for China at the expense of the party, not a kind of prospect that Xi Jinping would even contemplate.
You mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, that Xi Jinping thought may be named after one person, but it's not necessarily all coming from this one person. In fact, it's kind of a team effort. You mentioned by name Wang Honing, who's sort of usually credited as being sort of the chief ideologue within China's inner circle, but there are others. So given the fact that Xi Jinping thought is not flowing from this one person, how should we think about the often discussed fact that Xi Jinping is very likely to be reelected for a third term in a little less than a year, and there's no clear view on how a succession should it at some point become necessary, would play out. So is the centrality of Xi Jinping thought in Chinese political thinking and increasingly also daily life going to make it eventually harder to have an orderly succession after Xi Jinping leaves?
Well, I think that's a reasonable projection that you are making on current trajectory. The one word that I would be slightly more uncomfortable using is the word elect. Xi Jinping will not be elected the leader for the third term. Xi Jinping will make himself the leader for the third term. And the rest will simply fall in line, clap their hands, and applaud that. And elections implies that people actually have a kind of a free choice, and it was by the popular will of those in the electorate that result in it. I think that is sort of a misleading use of the term. Now, once Xi Jinping effectively broke the constitutional convention of 2 terms, 10 years as leader, then there's nothing to stop him staying on as leader indefinitely. With every party congress cycle as a formality to reaffirm his rule. That is, of course, unless something happens dramatically that would allow others to come up and challenge his authority and remove him. So short of that kind of scenario, he is going to be leader for life in China. And in this kind of political system, the most dangerous place to be is to be the annoyed successor. Nobody would want to be put in that position. And we already saw that a glimpse of that at the 19th Party Congress, when Hu Chunhua, who was being widely tipped as a potential next generation leader of the Communist Party, was in the runnings to become promoted from the Politburo to become the Politburo Standing Committee member. And at the 19th Party Congress, he let it be known that no, he was very happy being a Politburo member and wouldn't like to be a Politburo Standing Committee member, because given his age and profile, the mere risk of being seen as a potential successor to Xi Jinping would be politically so risky that he was smart enough not to allow himself to be put in that position. You are not going to have a lot of others moving forward who would want to be put in that position at all. So I don't think we are going to see a really credible succession plan being put in place, whatever Xi Jinping may thought of. Others wouldn't be keen to be put in that position. It also means that if everything goes according to Xi Jinping's plan, there will be no successor when biology finally does its work. And when Xi Jinping ceases being leader of China, we will see a rather chaotic situation for succession. The Death of Stalin movie, I think, would probably provide the best projections of what might be the most likely scenario, something that we really don't want to see happen in a country of China's significance. But having said all that, my caveat is that linear projections in history never work, particularly if it goes beyond 10 years. If you go back 20 years, nobody's prediction of where China would be 20 years from 20 years before materialized from today.
Well, Professor Tsang, your statement that linear projections in history never work, I think, is a very, very good point to end this fantastic conversation. I think that's something that we should all write down and remember every time we talk, not just about China, but about many things that happen in our world. This was incredibly enlightening and fascinating. There would be so much more that we could talk about, but let's end the conversation here. Thank you to you, Professor Tsang, for spending your time with us and for all your insights. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today for being here and for all your fantastic questions. I hope we could answer at least some of them. And I know there were many, many more.